She sued me with rules that never applied. 3 minutes later, I erased her entire HOA from existence. The late afternoon sun hung low, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac as I trudged to my mailbox, the gravel crunching under my sneakers. It was one of those oppressively ordinary days in Willow Creek, where the air smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass, and the distant hum of a lawnmower was the only sound breaking the suburban silence. I flipped open the rusted lid of my mailbox, expecting the usual assortment of junk mail and bills. Instead, my fingers brushed against a thick, cream-colored envelope that screamed trouble. The words HOA Legal Department were stamped across it in bold, crimson ink, like a warning written in blood. I tore it open, half expecting a fine for leaving my trash cans out an hour too long. What I found was worse: a lawsuit, 20 pages of legal jargon accusing me of willful violation of community standards and disruption of neighborhood harmony. The plaintiff, Karen Vandermeer, the self-proclaimed queen of Willow Creek's Homeowners Association. HOA Karen, as the neighborhood kids called her, was a force of nature, 5 feet of tightly wound fury in pastel cardigans, armed with a clipboard and an encyclopedic knowledge of every rule in the HOA handbook. She once fined a family for planting petunias instead of peonies, claiming it undermined the aesthetic cohesion of the block. The problem with her lawsuit: my house wasn't even in her HOA. I stood there, the envelope crinkling in my tightening grip, rereading the first page as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less absurd. My property sat just beyond the invisible line that separated Willow Creek's manicured HOA territory from the unincorporated patch of land I called home. My little bungalow, with its chipped paint and overgrown rose bushes, was technically outside her jurisdiction. I bought it precisely for that reason: no nosy neighbors dictating the height of my grass or the shade of my shutters. Yet here was Karen, claiming I'd violated rules that didn't apply to me, demanding $5,000 in reparative damages for offenses listed as excessive exterior clutter and unapproved modifications. The only clutter was a single lawn chair I'd left on my porch, and the modifications: I'd painted my mailbox blue. Apparently, that was a crime against humanity. I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled a squirrel into scampering up a nearby oak. This had to be a mistake. But as I skimmed the document, my amusement curdled into something colder. The lawsuit cited community complaints and included a grainy photo of my house, timestamped last week, with my offending mailbox circled in red. Someone, Karen, no doubt, had gone to the trouble of surveilling my property. The realization sent a prickle down my spine. This wasn't just petty, it was personal. I stuffed the papers back into the envelope and headed inside, my mind racing. Karen's reign of terror was infamous. She patrolled the neighborhood like a hawk, her SUV creeping along at 10 miles an hour as she jotted down infractions. Last month, she'd slapped a lien on the Wilsons' house because their kid's basketball hoop was 2 inches too tall. The month before, she'd organized a neighborhood watch meeting that was really just an excuse to shame anyone who dared park a pickup truck on the street. But me, I was nobody. Just a guy who kept to himself, paid his taxes, and occasionally forgot to mow his lawn. Why was she coming for me? The answer hit me as I dropped the envelope on my kitchen counter, next to a half-empty coffee mug and a stack of unopened mail. 3 weeks ago, I'd had a run-in with Karen at the community picnic. She'd cornered me by the potato salad, demanding I sign a petition to voluntarily join the HOA. I'd laughed, maybe a little too loudly, and told her I'd rather set my house on fire than let her tell me how to live. The look on her face had been pure venom, her lips pursed so tight I thought they'd crack. "You'll regret that," she'd hissed before storming off, her heels clicking on the pavement. I'd thought it was an empty threat. Clearly, I'd underestimated her. I sank into a chair, the lawsuit staring at me like an accusation. Part of me wanted to march over to her pristine McMansion, with its perfectly edged lawn and HOA-approved beige siding, and shove the papers in her face. But Karen wasn't the type to back down. She thrived on control, on bending people to her will with her endless rules and her ability to weaponize bureaucracy. Fighting her in court would be like wrestling a pig in mud. She'd enjoy it, and I'd just get dirty. That's when the idea hit me. Not a rational, measured response, but something reckless, something that matched the absurdity of her attack. If Karen thought she could drag me into her world of petty tyranny, she was about to learn that I could play dirty too. I didn't need a lawyer or a courtroom. I had something better, a knack for bending systems to my will, a skill I'd honed in quiet corners of the internet, far from the prying eyes of Willow Creek. Karen's HOA was built on rules, and rules were just code. Code could be rewritten or erased. 3 minutes later, I was at my desk, my laptop humming to life. The lawsuit lay forgotten on the counter as my fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up records, tracing digital threads. The HOA's website, their so-called community portal, was a flimsy thing, a relic of early 2000's web design with more security holes than a screen door. It was almost too easy. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting my living room in shadow, I'd found my way into the heart of their system. Membership lists, financial records, even the sacred bylaws, everything that made Karen's little empire tick. I leaned back, a grin spreading across my face. Karen thought she could sue me with rules that didn't apply. Fine. I'd make sure her HOA didn't apply either. Not to me, not to anyone. By morning, Willow Creek's Homeowners Association would be nothing more than a memory, dissolved into digital dust. And Karen, she'd learn what it felt like to lose control. The Willow Creek Community Center smelled like stale coffee and desperation, its fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, filled with neighbors who'd been roped into yet another of Karen Vandermeer's mandatory community gatherings. The walls were plastered with pastel posters proclaiming, "Together we thrive." An HOA, your voice, your home. But everyone knew these meetings were just Karen's stage to flex her authority. Tonight, though, the air felt heavier, charged with anticipation. Word of the lawsuit had spread like wildfire, and the room was packed with curious onlookers, their whispers humming like static. I sat near the back, my arms crossed, trying to blend into the sea of khakis and cardigans. My blue mailbox had become the talk of the neighborhood, a symbol of rebellion or idiocy, depending on who you asked. I'd spent the last 2 days digging deeper into the HOA's digital underbelly, mapping out their systems, but I hadn't pulled the trigger yet. Erasing an entire organization, even one as petty as Karen's, wasn't something you did on a whim. I needed to see her play her hand first, to gauge how far she was willing to go. At the front of the room, Karen stood tall at a flimsy wooden podium, her blonde bob so stiff with hairspray it looked like it could deflect bullets. She wore a navy blazer over a crisp white blouse, her signature pearl necklace gleaming under the lights like a badge of suburban supremacy. In her hand, she clutched a familiar cream-colored envelope, the lawsuit, waving it like a trophy as she addressed the crowd. Her voice was sharp, each word clipped with the precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment in front of a mirror. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her eyes sweeping the room before locking onto me, "we are here to discuss a serious breach of our community's standards. This man," she pointed the envelope in my direction, her manicured nail like a dagger, "thinks he's exempt from our rules just because he lives on the edge of the lake." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, eyes darting toward me. Some faces were curious, others openly hostile, as if my blue mailbox had personally offended their sense of order. Mrs. Jenkins, who baked cookies for every HOA event, clutched her purse tighter. Mr. Larson, the guy who power washed his driveway every Sunday, shook his head like I'd spat in his coffee. Karen had them eating out of her hand, and she knew it. She flipped open the envelope, pulling out the stack of legal papers with a flourish. "This lawsuit," she continued, her voice rising, "is not just about one man's refusal to comply. It's about protecting the values that make Willow Creek a desirable place to live. Property values, safety, aesthetic harmony." Each phrase was punctuated with a jab of the papers as if she were stabbing the air itself. If we let one person flout our rules, what's next? Neon signs, junk cars, chaos. The room nodded along, a chorus of obedient bobbleheads. Corinne's smirk widened, her eyes glinting with triumph. She thought she had me cornered, that this public shamming would force me to bend the knee. But I dealt with bullies like her before, not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the quiet corners of code, where power wasn't about who could yell the loudest but who could rewrite the rules. I stood up slowly, letting the creak of my chair cut through the murmurs. All eyes turned to me and the room fell silent. Corinne's smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. I kept my voice calm, steady, like I was commenting on the weather. That's because I am exempt. The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, and a few nervous chuckles filled the air. Mrs. Jenkins dropped her purse. Mr. Larson's jaw hit the floor. Corinne's face froze, her eyes narrowing into slits as she gripped the podium like it was the only thing keeping her upright. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with venom. I stepped into the aisle, hands in my pockets, keeping my tone even. "My house isn't in your HOA, Corinne. Never has been. You can wave those papers all you want, but you don't have jurisdiction over me. You're suing a ghost." The whispers grew louder, a mix of confusion and intrigue. A few people pulled out their phones, probably Googling property lines or texting their friends about the drama unfolding. Corinne's cheeks flushed pink, clashing with her blazer. She wasn't used to being challenged, not like this, not in her own kingdom. "That's absurd," she snapped, slamming the lawsuit down on the podium. "Your property may be on the edge, but you still impact our community. That hideous mailbox, for starters." "Hideous?" I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. A few people snickered and Corinne's flush deepened. "It's blue. It's a mailbox. If that's your idea of a crime, maybe you should sue the sky next." Laughter broke out, louder this time, and Corinne's control slipped another notch. She banged her fist on the podium, the sound echoing like a gavel. "This is not a joke," she shouted. "You think you can mock our rules, our community? I have evidence, photos, complaints, witnesses. You will comply or you will face the consequences." I tilted my head, studying her. The lawsuit was a bluff, a power play to scare me into submission. But she'd miscalculated. She didn't know about the ace up my sleeve, the digital skeleton key I'd found in her HOA's poorly secured servers. I could have ended this right then, told her I'd already cracked her system and could wipe her precious organization from existence with a few keystrokes. But where was the fun in that? I wanted her to squirm a little longer. "Consequences," I said, my smile widening. "Corinne, you're about to find out what happens when you pick a fight with someone who doesn't play by your rules." The room went quiet again, the tension thick enough to choke on. Corinne's eyes bored into mine, searching for a crack in my confidence, but I didn't blink. For the first time, she looked uncertain, like she just realized she might have bitten off more than she could chew. The crowd was watching, waiting, sensing that something bigger was at play. I turned and walked out, leaving Corinne frozen at her podium, the lawsuit crumpled in her hand. Back at home, my laptop was waiting, its screen glowing softly in the dark. The HOA's digital empire was mine for the taking. 3 minutes, I thought. 3 minutes and I could erase it all. But first, I'd let Corinne think she'd won, just for one more night. The glow of my laptop screen bathed my living room in a pale blue haze, the only light in the house as midnight crept closer. Outside, Willow Creek slept under a blanket of stars, oblivious to the storm I was brewing. Corinne's lawsuit sat on my coffee table, its pages dog-eared and annotated with my scribbled notes. I hadn't just read the HOA bylaws she'd so proudly waved at the community meeting. I'd studied them like scripture, poring over every clause, every loophole, every self-important rule she'd weaponized. And what I'd found wasn't just a defense, it was a kill shot. My house, that little bungalow on the edge of the lake, wasn't just outside the HOA's boundaries. It was deeded years before the Willow Creek Homeowners Association even existed. I'd pulled the county records online, cross-referencing the plat maps with the HOA's charter. My property was a holdover from a time when this area was just farmland and dirt roads, before Karen's pastel empire of picket fences and approved paint colors. The HOA's jurisdiction stopped at my property line, as clear as a brick wall. Her lawsuit was built on a foundation of sand, and I was ready to kick it over. But the real discovery came later, deep in the rabbit hole of public records and forgotten databases. I'd spent hours digging, fueled by coffee and spite, following digital breadcrumbs through the county clerk's website and the state's corporate registry. That's when I found it. The Willow Creek HOA's corporate registration, the legal backbone that gave it authority to enforce its rules, was set to expire in 3 days. 3 days. Unless renewed, the HOA would cease to exist as a legal entity. No bylaws, no fines, no lawsuits. Just a ghost of bureaucracy, powerless to bother anyone. And Karen hadn't filed the renewal paperwork. I leaned back in my chair, a slow grin spreading across my face. The oversight was almost too perfect, like a gift from the gods of petty revenge. Karen, with her obsession for control, her endless checklists and clipboard patrols, had missed the one deadline that mattered. I could have stopped there, let the clock run out and watch her empire crumble on its own. But where was the fun in that? I wanted her to know it was me. I wanted her to feel the ground shift beneath her feet, the way she'd tried to make me feel with her baseless lawsuit. I opened another tab, pulling up the HOA's website again. It was a clunky relic, all Comic Sans and broken links, but it held everything. Membership rosters, financials, even the sacred bylaws Karen treated like holy writ. The security was laughable, a default admin password that hadn't been changed in years. I'd already mapped out the system's weak points after the community meeting, but now I went deeper, downloading everything. Every email, every complaint, every fine she'd ever issued. It was a goldmine of her tyranny, and I was the prospector. The bylaws confirmed what the county records suggested. Without a valid corporate registration, the HOA had no legal standing, no ability to sue, no authority to enforce anything. Karen's lawsuit was a paper tiger, and I had the match to burn it down. But I didn't just want to win. I wanted to dismantle her world piece by piece until she understood what it felt like to be powerless. I started drafting an email, anonymous for now, to the HOA's board members. Not the public-facing email list Karen controlled, but the personal addresses I'd pulled from the server. The message was simple, clinical, and devastating. A screenshot of the state's corporate registry, highlighting the impending expiration date, paired with a polite question. Did you know your HOA is about to dissolve? I didn't sign it. I didn't need to. The truth would do the work for me. But that was just the opening salvo. The real plan was forming in my mind, a way to ensure Karen's reign ended not with a whimper but a bang. The HOA's server held more than just records. It had the keys to their entire operation. Their payment portal, their community app, even the automated emails that sent out fine notices. A few lines of code, a well-placed script, and I could make it all vanish. No more fines for petunias or basketball hoops. No more Karen, standing at her podium like a suburban dictator. I glanced at the clock too, 17. The expiration date loomed, a ticking bomb Karen didn't even know existed. I could wait, let the bureaucracy do its work, or I could take matters into my own hands. The lawsuit, the community meeting, her smug smirk, they all played in my head like a looped reel. She wanted a fight, and she'd picked the wrong opponent. I wasn't just some guy with a blue mailbox. I was the glitch in her system, the variable she hadn't accounted for. I cracked my knuckles and started typing. 3 days was plenty of time to rewrite the rules of Willow Creek. By the time Karen realized what was happening, her HOA would be nothing but a memory, erased from existence like a bad line of code. And I'd be there, watching her kingdom fall, with a smile as calm as the one I'd worn at the meeting. The Willow Creek Courthouse was a squat, beige building that smelled faintly of mildew and old paper, its walls lined with faded portraits of stern-looking judges. The courtroom itself was small, with creaky wooden benches and a ceiling fan that wheezed like it was on its last legs. I sat in the defendant's chair, a worn-out cushion under me, clutching a manila folder stuffed with the fruits of my late-night research. Across the room, Corinne Vandermeer sat ramrod straight, her blonde bob still defying gravity, her navy blazer pressed to perfection. She radiated confidence, her lips curled into a smug half-smile as she whispered to her lawyer, a weaselly man in a cheap suit who kept nodding like a bobblehead. She thought she had me cornered, that her lawsuit would bury me under the weight of her HOA's rules. She had no idea what was coming. The judge, a grizzled man with a face like weathered leather, shuffled papers at the bench, his glasses perched precariously on his nose. The room was half full, mostly with Willow Creek residents who'd shown up for the spectacle, Mrs. Jenkins clutching her purse, Mr. Larson frowning like I'd personally offended his driveway. The rest were HOA board members, their faces a mix of curiosity and unease after receiving my anonymous email 2 nights ago. I'd spent the last 48 hours preparing, cross-referencing every detail, ensuring my plan was airtight. The HOA's corporate registration had expired at midnight, just as I'd predicted. Corinne's empire was legally dead, and I was about to deliver the obituary. The hearing began with the usual formalities, names read, charges outlined. Corinne's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie like he was auditioning for a courtroom drama, and launched into a rehearsed spiel about my flagrant disregard for community standards. He waved the same grainy photo of my blue mailbox, now blown up to poster size, as if it were evidence of a capital crime. Corinne nodded along, her smirk growing with every word, her pearl necklace glinting under the fluorescent lights. The lawyer cited bylaws, community complaints, and the sanctity of Willow Creek's aesthetic harmony, painting me as a rogue threatening the very fabric of suburban life. The judge listened, his expression unreadable, occasionally jotting notes. 3 minutes in, the lawyer paused to sip water and I saw my opening. I stood, ignoring the surprised murmurs from the gallery, and cleared my throat. "Your Honor, may I approach?" The judge raised an eyebrow but nodded. Corinne's lawyer froze, glass halfway to his lips. I walked to the bench, my folder in hand, and slid it across the polished wood. "This lawsuit is invalid," I said, keeping my voice steady but firm. "The plaintiff has no standing. This HOA," I tapped the folder, "legally no longer exists." A gasp rippled through the room. Corinne's jaw dropped, her carefully curated composure cracking like cheap porcelain. Her lawyer sputtered objection, but the judge silenced him with a raised hand, already flipping through my documents. I'd included everything. The county plat maps proving my property was outside HOA jurisdiction, the state's corporate registry showing the HOA's expired status, and a printout of the email I'd sent to the board, timestamped 2 days ago, warning them of the lapse. The final page was a screenshot of the HOA's website, now displaying a 404 error after I'd quietly pulled the plug on their server last night. A little insurance to ensure they couldn't scramble to refile before the hearing. The judge skimmed the papers, his glasses sliding further down his nose. He lingered on the registry document, then looked up at Corinne's lawyer. "Counselor, were you aware your client's organization is no longer a registered entity?" The lawyer's face went pale, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Your Honor, we were not informed." "Of course you weren't," I cut in, unable to resist. "Your client was too busy suing people outside her jurisdiction to notice her own organization was dissolving." The gallery erupted in whispers, a few stifled laughs breaking through. Corinne shot to her feet, her face beet red. "This is outrageous," she shrieked. "He's lying. The HOA is perfectly valid. He's just trying to weasel out of." "Sit down, Ms. Vandermeer," the judge snapped, his voice like a whip. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling as she clutched her purse. The judge adjusted his glasses and continued reading, his brow furrowing. After a long moment, he set the folder down and leaned forward, his gaze shifting between me and Corinne's lawyer. "These documents appear to confirm the defendant's claim," he said, his tone measured but final. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association's corporate registration expired 2 days ago, rendering it without legal standing to pursue this case. Furthermore, the defendant's property is clearly outside the HOA's jurisdiction. This lawsuit is baseless. Corinne's lawyer stammered, trying to salvage something. Your Honor, we can refile the registration immediately. Too late, I said, crossing my arms. The deadline passed. The HOA is gone. The judge shot me a look, but I caught the faintest twitch of amusement at the corner of his mouth. He turned back to the lawyer. Counselor, your client failed to maintain her organization's legal status. That's not the defendant's fault. It's yours. The room was silent now, the weight of the moment settling over everyone. Corinne stared at the floor, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. The judge picked up his gavel, the sound of it cracking through the air like thunder. Case dismissed, he said. HOA dissolved. The gallery exploded, gasps, cheers, a few angry mutters. Mrs. Jenkins clapped her hands over her mouth. Mr. Larson looked like he'd just seen a ghost. Corinne's lawyer slumped in his chair, defeated, while Corinne herself sat frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief, as if the world she'd built had crumbled in an instant. And it had. I gathered my folder and walked out, feeling the weight of every stare on my back. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the lake shimmering in the distance. I'd done more than win a lawsuit. I'd erased Corinne's HOA from existence, not with a hack or a script, but with the law itself. Her rules, her power, her precious control, all gone in the slam of a gavel. But as I headed home, a nagging thought crept in. Corinne wasn't the type to let this go. She'd lost her kingdom, but she'd be back angrier, more desperate, and with nothing left to lose. I'd won this round, but the war wasn't over. Not yet. The Willow Creek courthouse steps were bathed in the pale light of an overcast morning, the air heavy with the promise of rain. The crowd spilled out behind me, a mix of neighbors, HOA board members, and curious onlookers who'd come for the drama and gotten more than they bargained for. The judge's gavel still echoed in my ears, case dismissed. HOA dissolved. A death knell for Corinne Vandermeer's suburban empire. I lingered near the entrance, my manila folder tucked under my arm, watching the chaos unfold like a scene from a bad reality show. Corinne stormed out of the courtroom, her navy blazer slightly askew, her blonde bob no longer defying gravity but fraying at the edges, strands sticking to her sweat-dampened forehead. Her pearl necklace bounced with every furious step, and her heels clicked against the stone steps like gunfire. She was a hurricane in human form, her face a blotchy mix of rage and humiliation. Behind her, her lawyer scurried to keep up, his cheap suit wrinkled, his face pale as he clutched a briefcase that looked as defeated as he did. The HOA board members trailed behind, a gaggle of nervous middle-aged men and women in pastel polos, their whispers drowned out by Corinne's escalating tirade. "This is a travesty," she shrieked, spinning to face the board members who flinched as if she'd swung a fist. "You incompetent fools let this happen. You let him." She jabbed a manicured finger in my direction, her voice cracking. "Destroy everything we've built." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty to Corinne crumbling faster than her composure. One of them, a balding man with a perpetually sweaty forehead, mumbled, "Corinne, we didn't know the registration expired. You were supposed to." "Supposed to," she cut him off, her voice rising to a pitch that made a nearby pigeon take flight. "I was busy protecting this community from people like him." She pointed at me again, her hand trembling. "You all sat back and did nothing while he schemed and lied and tore down our rules." I leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, letting her words roll off me like water. The crowd was growing, neighbors pulling out their phones, some filming, others texting furiously, the whispers swelling into a low hum of gossip. Mrs. Jenkins, still clutching her purse like a lifeline, muttered to Mr. Larson, "She's lost it." Mr. Larson, for once, didn't scowl at me. He was too busy recording Corinne's meltdown, his phone held at an awkward angle. Corinne noticed the cameras and spun toward the crowd, her eyes wild. "What are you all staring at?" she snapped. "This isn't over. You'll all regret this. I'll rebuild the HOA stronger than ever, and you'll all answer to me." A few people laughed, sharp and mocking. Others shook their heads, pity mixing with amusement. Corinne's threats landed like pebbles in a pond, ripples but no impact. Everyone knew the truth, even if she couldn't admit it. It was over. The HOA was gone, dissolved by her own negligence and my well-placed nudge. Her rules, her fines, her clipboard patrols, all reduced to nothing in the slam of a judge's gavel. The neighborhood was free, and the weight of that freedom hung in the air, palpable, intoxicating. I stepped forward just enough to catch her eye. "Corinne," I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry, "you can't rebuild what doesn't exist. Maybe it's time to let go." Her head snapped toward me, her eyes blazing with a fury that could have melted steel. For a moment I thought she might lunge at me, pearls and all. But the crowd was watching, phones still rolling, and even Corinne knew better than to make a scene she couldn't spin. Instead, she straightened, smoothing her blazer with shaking hands, and hissed, "You think you've won. You're nothing. This neighborhood will fall apart without me." I shrugged, a slow smile spreading across my face. "We'll take that chance." The crowd murmured in agreement, a few voices calling out, "Yeah." "And good riddance." Corinne's face crumpled, the last of her bravado draining away. She turned on her heel, shoving past her lawyer and the board members, and stormed toward her SUV, parked crookedly across two spaces. The engine roared to life and she peeled out of the lot, tires squealing, leaving a trail of exhaust and stunned silence. The neighbors lingered, some still filming, others clustering in small groups to dissect the meltdown. Mrs. Jenkins approached me, her eyes wide. "Did you really do it? Shut down the whole HOA?" I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "The law did the work. I just pointed it in the right direction." Mr. Larson, still holding his phone, grunted. About time someone stood up to her. It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever gotten from him. As the crowd dispersed, I walked back to my car, the lake visible in the distance, its surface rippling under the gray sky. Corinne's meltdown had been the cherry on top, a public unraveling that sealed her defeat. But as I slid into the driver's seat, a flicker of unease crept in. Corinne wasn't the type to slink away quietly. She'd lost her power, her control, her stage. But people like her didn't just disappear. They regrouped, schemed, found new ways to claw their way back. I started the engine, my folder of documents resting on the passenger seat. The HOA was gone, but I'd keep my guard up. Corinne's meltdown was the end of one chapter, but I had a feeling she'd try to write another. And when she did, I'd be ready. The silence after the HOA dissolved wasn't empty, it was liberating. For the first time in years, the neighborhood didn't feel like a prison dressed up as a community. Gone were the constant warning letters tucked under windshield wipers, the thinly veiled threats about compliance, the endless petty inspections. The stranglehold snapped overnight, and what rose in its place was something raw, ungoverned, and alive. Families stepped out of their houses as if waking from a long, oppressive sleep. Children who once played cautiously, always looking over their shoulders for a patrolling HOA volunteer, now sprinted across lawns and rode bikes down the street without fear of reprimand. Holiday lights, bold, mismatched, and gloriously rebellious, sprang up on porches like fireworks. Some families strung lights in July just because they could. Lawns grew a little wild. Flowers bloomed where uniformity once demanded sterile sameness, and driveways filled with laughter instead of whispered complaints about violations. Neighbors who had barely spoken beyond stiff nods began to connect. Saturday barbecues popped up, potlucks spread across front yards, and the sound of music, real, joyful music, not the stifled whispers of households afraid of a noise complaint, pulsed through the evenings. For the first time in decades, people felt like they actually owned their homes, their choices, their lives. But the absence of the HOA didn't just bring joy. It also exposed scars. Some homeowners still flinched when their doorbells rang, half expecting another fine. Others confessed how deep the control had burrowed into their daily routines, checking their grass height obsessively, painting over tiny chips in the trim, hiding harmless projects out of fear. It would take time to unlearn the cage they had lived in. And then there were Karen's loyalists, those who had thrived under her reign. A few of them grumbled loudly, predicting chaos and decline. But even they were forced to admit the neighborhood hadn't fallen apart. If anything, it was thriving. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the rooftops, I stood at the edge of my yard watching kids toss a football down the street. Parents leaned on mailboxes, chatting, sipping beers, not a care in the world. For once, the air wasn't heavy with fear. It was filled with freedom. The HOA was gone, and in its place, the community had finally come alive. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper, ink, and old wood polish, the kind of scent that carried the weight of permanence. Every step I took across the marble floor echoed, sharp and deliberate like a countdown. For weeks I had been gathering evidence, signing affidavits, and chasing legal threads through a maze of bureaucracy. Now everything came down to this. One last signature, one last line of ink that would erase the HOA's chokehold from existence. The clerk at the records office glanced at my paperwork with professional indifference at first, but when her eyes skimmed the highlighted section, the dissolution order, her brows lifted. "You're serious?" she asked, almost whispering. "As serious as it gets," I replied. She gave a small shrug, stamped the papers, and slid them into the official file. The thunk of the seal echoed through the room. In that moment, years of fines, harassment, and petty tyranny crumbled into dust. The HOA's name, once wielded like a weapon over every mailbox, lawn, and doorstep, was struck from the county's official registry. It was over. I walked out into the sunlight, papers in hand, and the world felt different, lighter. The courthouse steps seemed less steep, the sky bluer, the breeze freer. Word traveled fast, faster than I imagined. By that evening, neighbors were gathering in driveways with folding chairs and coolers. Someone dragged out a grill, another popped open bottles of champagne. For the first time in years, the laughter wasn't cautious, it was triumphant. "To freedom," one man shouted, raising his glass. "To finally living like human beings again," another chimed in. The cheer that followed was deafening, echoing through streets once ruled by silence and fear. Fireworks even went off, small ones, smuggled from out-of-state years earlier but never dared to be lit until now. Sparks showered across the night sky, each explosion a nail in the coffin of Karen's empire. But amidst the joy, I couldn't help scanning the shadows. A few houses stayed dark, curtains drawn. Karen's loyalists, no doubt. And Karen herself, where was she now? Rumors swirled. Some said she had locked herself inside her house. Others claimed they saw her loading boxes into her car. Whatever the truth, I knew one thing. Her reign had ended not with a bang, not with some grand confrontation, but with the flick of a pen at the county record's office. Sometimes the sharpest revenge is the quietest. The night she came, the air felt heavier than usual. A late summer wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint scent of cut grass and charcoal smoke from a neighbor's lingering barbecue. The neighborhood had grown used to its newfound freedom, holiday lights still strung across porches, music spilling out of open garage doors. But on my side of the street it was quiet, too quiet. I was sitting on my porch with a book I hadn't been able to finish in years. The sound of crickets filled the stillness. Then I heard it, the sharp staccato of heels on pavement, echoing in the dark, a rhythm that didn't belong. I looked up and there she was. Karen. Her figure cut through the night like a blade, her silhouette framed by the dim yellow glow of the street lamp. She was still dressed like she was attending an HOA meeting, pressed slacks, stiff blouse, pearls at her throat. But the details betrayed her. Her hair was frizzed and uneven, her makeup streaked, her movements frantic. The queen without her crown. She didn't stop at the curb. She marched straight into my driveway like it was her courtroom. "You," her voice cracked like glass, You ruined everything." I closed the book, set it on the armrest, and leaned back, refusing to give her the satisfaction of my alarm. "Evening, Karen," I said calmly. Her hands shook, clenched fists glowing white under the porch light. "Do you know how much power I had? How many years I built this community, shaped it, controlled it?" She jabbed a finger toward me like a spear. "And you, some nobody, just erased it with your smug little papers." I rose slowly, not to intimidate but to face her squarely. I leaned on the wooden fence at the edge of the porch, meeting her fire with quiet steel. "You never had power," I said. "You had paper, paper and fear, that's all." Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The words hit her harder than I expected. For a moment her eyes flickered, not anger but something else. Fear. "You think this is over," she hissed. "You think you've won? I built this place. Without me it'll rot, it'll become chaos. Trash in the streets, cars on the lawns, weeds growing everywhere. And when that happens, don't you dare forget, you'll be to blame." Her voice echoed into the night, bouncing off the darkened houses around us. A curtain shifted in the window across the street. A neighbor was listening. I smirked. "Funny, looks like people are doing just fine without you. Better, actually. You mistook control for care. Nobody needed your permission to live their lives." Her jaw worked furiously. "You arrogant little—" She stopped herself, chest heaving, hands trembling so violently it looked as if she might shatter right there on my driveway. "You don't understand what you've done," she whispered finally, voice breaking. "The connections I had, the board, the influence. Do you think people like me just vanish?" Her words were more threat than truth, but I didn't flinch. "People like you burn themselves out," I said. "All it takes is one spark." Her face twisted with rage. For a heartbeat I thought she might strike me. Instead, she spat at the ground, the sound sharp against the silence. "You'll regret this," she snarled. "Mark my words, I'll make sure you regret it." And then she turned, storming down the driveway, heels snapping against the concrete until the darkness swallowed her whole. The street was silent again except for the crickets. I leaned back on the fence, unshaken. She wanted me rattled, wanted me afraid, but I'd already seen the truth. Karen wasn't a queen anymore. She was just a bitter woman clinging to ashes. Still, her words lingered. Not because I believed them, but because of the venom behind them. People like Karen didn't just disappear quietly. They always had one last card to play. And that night, as the shadows closed in, I couldn't help but wonder, what would hers be? The neighbors talked for weeks after. Some swore they'd seen her car circling the block late at night. Others claimed she was making calls, trying to rally support from her old allies. A few said she'd gone to the county, threatening lawsuits, begging for loopholes. But deep down, everyone knew it was over. The HOA was dead. Karen was grasping at smoke. And yet I couldn't shake the image of her face, the fury, the desperation. A cornered animal stripped of her throne, teeth bared for a final strike. Her final move hadn't come yet. But it would. Spring arrived quietly, almost as if the earth itself had been waiting for the storm to pass. After the long, tense winter where Karen's shadow still lingered at the edges of memory, the thaw came with more than just warm air. It carried freedom. Lawns, once trimmed to militant precision out of fear of fines, began to breathe again. Dandelions dotted the grass like golden confetti, and instead of complaints, children picked them for their mothers, weaving them into little crowns. Gardens sprouted color in every direction. Roses, tulips, and wildflowers spilled over fences as if nature itself were celebrating the fall of Karen's reign. The streets, once patrolled by Karen's clipboard brigade, now belonged to the kids. They biked in packs, their laughter ringing out as they chased one another down the block. Sidewalk chalk covered the concrete with rainbows, hopscotch grids, and smiling suns. Where silence and suspicion had ruled, there was noise and joy. Barbecues became almost a weekly ritual. What started as one neighbor grilling in his backyard spread like wildfire. Folding chairs appeared on driveways, coolers lined with soda and beer were cracked open, and the air filled with the smell of sizzling meat. Families mingled who had barely spoken in years. Old grudges began to melt. People traded recipes, swapped garden seeds, and even formed small co-ops to help one another with repairs and projects. More than once, I caught myself smiling at things I'd once thought ordinary but had become extraordinary in Corinne's era of control. A basketball hoop left on the street, a camper parked in someone's driveway, wind chimes clinking from a porch. Each one was a small rebellion, a reminder that we had taken our lives back. But beneath the joy, there was also reflection. Over beer bottles and late-night conversations, neighbors confessed the weight they had carried for years. One man admitted he'd almost sold his house because the fines were drowning him. A young couple revealed that they'd hidden their dog at their parents' house for months, afraid Corinne would cite them for having the wrong breed. An elderly widow broke down crying when she explained how isolated she had felt, terrified of being targeted for her peeling paint she couldn't afford to fix. It was painful to hear, but it was also healing. For the first time, people shared not just food, but truth. And in that truth, the neighborhood became something real again, not a collection of houses under a rule book, but a community. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, I sat on my porch and watched as a group of neighbors lit lanterns and let them float into the air. The glowing orbs drifted upward, carrying silent wishes into the night. Children clapped, parents cheered, and for a moment it felt like the entire neighborhood was exhaling together. Corinne's reign had stolen years from us. Years of laughter, of trust, of simple human connection. But now those years were being reclaimed. Not all at once, not perfectly, but piece by piece, weekend by weekend, spring by spring. The neighborhood wasn't just surviving without her, it was reborn. And as I leaned back in my chair, listening to the chorus of voices and the sizzle of a distant grill, I realized something. This was what true power looked like. Not control, not fear, but freedom shared and lived by everyone. The morning broke soft and golden, the kind of dawn that promised peace rather than battles. The mist lifted slowly from the lake, curling like ghostly ribbons above the water's surface. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee in my hand, steam rising in lazy spirals, and listened to the neighborhood around me. It was alive in a way I had never heard before, not with tension, not with whispered complaints or the faint sound of a gavel in Corinne's head, but with laughter. Children's voices carried across the street. Two kids raced their bikes down the hill toward the lake, tires humming, shouts echoing, their joy unchained. A couple of dogs barked as they bounded across the grass, chasing after them. Wind chimes jingled from a neighbor's porch, not in defiance of a rule book, but simply because someone wanted to hear a song in the wind. I took a slow sip of coffee and smiled. Across the way, Corinne's old house sat empty. The once pristine hedges she had trimmed into sharp angles now grew ragged. The shooters were peeling, the lawn overgrown. A big white sign staked in the front yard leaned slightly in the soil. For sale. It was poetic, really. That house had been her throne, the stage for all her power plays and neighborhood decrees. Now stripped of its queen, it was just another hollow box waiting for a new family. Her empire had crumbled, not in flames or fury, but in silence. Her legacy, reduced to nothing more than a bitter memory. I leaned back in my chair, watching as my neighbors gathered by the lake. Someone had set up a grill. The smell of sausages and onions wafted through the breeze. Folding chairs dotted the shoreline, coolers cracked open, laughter rising like music. It was a far cry from the fearful hush that had once ruled these streets. And in that moment, I realized something important. I wasn't just the man who had lived outside the HOA. I was the man who ended it. The weight of victory. When I first moved here, I never imagined it would come to this. Back then, the HOA seemed like a nuisance, a small-town oddity I could shrug off. But Corinne had made sure of one thing. There was no shrugging off her rule. She and her loyalists had turned the association into a regime, weaponizing bylaws and threatening fines like soldiers wielding rifles. Every mailbox color, every blade of grass, every decoration controlled. And now the rulebook was gone. Karen's reign was gone. The very name of the HOA had been struck from the county records like it never existed. But the cost was real. I thought about the neighbors who had suffered under her hand, the fines that had nearly bankrupted families, the projects abandoned because they weren't approved, the friendships strained by whispered accusations and tattling. Years of stolen joy. Years none of us would get back. The weight of that history sat heavy, even on a morning as beautiful as this. Victory wasn't just about winning. It was about remembering why the fight had mattered. Karen's exit. No one saw Karen on moving day. Some said she left in the dead of night, headlights cutting one final scar across the street before vanishing for good. Others swore they saw her car loaded with boxes days earlier, her face pale and tight, lips pressed into a line that betrayed both anger and shame. The truth was, it didn't matter, she was gone. Her threats, her fury, her clipboard, her pearls, all gone with her. What she left behind was more telling: silence. A silence that wasn't empty but healing. Sometimes defeat doesn't come with fanfare. Sometimes it's just a for sale sign leaning in the yard of a fallen tyrant. The neighborhood heals. That spring and summer became something of a renaissance. People tried things they hadn't dared in years. One neighbor painted his house a deep blue, a color Karen would have had fined into extinction. Another family bought a second-hand camper and parked it proudly in their driveway. No violation letters came. No patrols. Just neighbors nodding in approval. And the gardens. Oh, the gardens. Without rules dictating acceptable plants, the neighborhood bloomed in ways I'd never imagined. Wildflowers spilled across fences, sunflowers towered proudly, and kids planted vegetables in raised beds that lined the sidewalks. Every yard became a canvas of individuality. Barbecues became more than just food, they became symbols. Every weekend, the smell of burgers and ribs drifted through the streets, drawing people together. Old grudges dissolved over beers and laughter. New friendships sparked across folding chairs and picnic tables. Even the lake seemed to reflect the change. Families swam freely, children splashed near the docks, and boats dotted the surface at sunset. For years, Karen had tried to regulate who could use what, when, and how. Now the water belonged to everyone. I'd sit on my porch and watch it all unfold. And each time, I felt the same quiet pride swell in my chest. Not because I had won, but because we had reclaimed something that never should have been stolen in the first place. Reflection. It's strange the way life works. One woman's obsession with control had strangled hundreds of lives, and yet, in tearing down her empire, we discovered something deeper than rebellion. We discovered community. Freedom wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was simple. It was children riding bikes without looking over their shoulders. It was wind chimes swaying without fear of fines. It was a neighbor sharing tomatoes from her garden just because she could. That was the final word. Not Karen's, not the HOA, not mine, ours. The porch. I looked down at the coffee in my hand, steam curling in the cool morning air. Across the street, a father tossed a frisbee to his daughter. Next door, someone laughed so hard it carried across their lawn like music. The HOA was gone. Karen was gone. The neighborhood was alive. And me. I was no longer just the man who lived outside the HOA. I was the one who ended it. And I wouldn't trade that final word for anything.